Chapter 11: A New Strain. The fallout from the Weasley twins' masterpiece prank had been as spectacular as they had hoped. The different houses either consigning themselves to abject humiliation by trying to communicate their anger or having to hold their tongue for a day. Even as they were both assaulted by various animal noises in their classes, concealing the sort of language that would have seen everyone lose house points, they laughed their silly laughs. They had concluded at the end of the day, as they served their first detention of a very long stint, that it had been both a banner April's Fool's and birthday. When their friends and housemates had started up again the next day with their accusations and insults, they had loudly pondered what they might do for next year. More than a few would have pegged them for Slytherins had their inclinations been more malicious. Not everyone hated the Redheads for their ultimately harmless prank. A couple Hufflepuffs, one or two Ravenclaws and a minority of Gryffindors had seen the humor of their situations, if only in hindsight. Luna had rather enjoyed both the feathers and the birds speak. She had, what she considered, a very lively debate with an owl during her lunch period. She believed she had won in spirit if not content. The barn owl had an incoherent dialect, but she didn't want to offend him, so she hadn't mentioned it. Draco had been indignant, threatening to notify his father of the trespass for the first time in months. Gara noted that Draco hadn't actually written to Lucius about the prank, but it was still interesting to note how Draco regressed when faced with humiliation. Gara thought back to his own humiliations and how his father might have reacted to hearing about them. It likely would have led to a number of extra assassins being sent to kill Gara during his time of weakness. He would have asked, but his father was dead. Gara wiped the smile off of his face before anyone saw it and thought him a fool for smiling at nothing. It was rather interesting, I suppose. Being unable to speak for a day. I think I can understand what you go through now. At least you don't have a forked tongue, though. Gara considered the shallow and narcissistic statement, but agreed to the last point. It did seem a little inconvenient to be sticking his tongue out all the time. And it would look ridiculous. Speaking of ridiculous, those two idiotic pranksters had approached him yesterday after excluding him from their school-wide prank, to claim back their pranking crown. He had no idea what they were talking about, but agreed that they could have the crown if they wanted it. They had high-fived and run off when a bunch of 7th-year Slytherins had spotted them. The Snakes hadn't taken to the prank in any sort of good humor, so the twins, and in fact all of the Weasleys, had become enemy number one in Slytherin. It was a mixed blessing to be knocked off of the top spot for Gara. The school returned to their prior darkened moods pretty sharply after another sighting of Sirius Black had been reported in Hogsmeade. The students had quickly forgotten their excitement or their anger and had returned to fear. Even the Slytherins were uneasy about Sirius Black because he wasn't a regular pure-blood fanatic. He was a true lunatic. The teachers tried to restore order, and some even attempted to lighten the mood by mentioning the prank, the Quidditch finals coming up, or even the end-of-year exams. Any distraction, but the children were still spooked. Gara, as he always was after reading one of these articles about Sirius, was equal parts worried and exhausted for and by his friend in the shack. At least his friend back in his own world was capable of getting himself out of most of the problems he got himself into. Now, if only Draco and Sirius were so resourceful or capable, Gara could sleep soundly at night. Well, he could read more comfortably at night. It was over lunch that afternoon, one of the few that Gara bothered attending, that Hagrid approached him with an invitation to tea at his hut that evening. The invitation was extended to Draco as well, but the blonde snob politely declined the chance for more rock-hard cakes and tea out of cups that still smelled of whatever extra strong brandy had last filled them. Hagrid wouldn't say why he was inviting Gara, but no one was in any doubt that Gara would be safe enough meeting the man alone in his home. Despite how powerful Gara was understood to be, the rules still applied, as far as the teachers were concerned, so Hagrid told his student that he would come and collect him from the Slytherin common room at 8, after dinner. God forbid Sirius Black run into Gaara as he was making his way to Hagrid's home in the dark of the night. When Draco had posited that scenario, albeit with less drama, Gaara had wondered. Chances were, if Sirius were to encounter Gaara in a darkened hallway, he would probably scream, transform into a dog and run away with his tail between his legs. He certainly would if he had done something particularly crass to offend Gaara that day. Gaara acquiesced to Hagrid's offer, if only to be polite to one of the friendlier professors in the school. Plus Hagrid happened to be the single largest man Gaara had ever seen in either world. The Raikage was large, as were a few of the Qirin he had encountered, but Hagrid was twice as tall as Gaara at least. It seemed like no one in this world knew how to fight properly, certainly nowhere near the level his own could, and he had heard that Hagrid did not have access to a wand for some reason, so his threat was further diminished. But if the redhead had learned anything from his time as a fuzzy, fluffy, super plush tanuki demon, it was to not needlessly antagonize the beings larger than you if you can avoid it. Plus he needed a night away from research, homework, Slaughter and Draco, and his entertainment options were otherwise quite limited. Ironically, Gaara garnered a number of confused looks from his housemates when they saw him in the common room after dinner like he was supposed to be. It may have also been to do with the fact that he wasn't with Draco and he wasn't reading. May had debated the Sorting Hat's choice to place Gaara in Slytherin, partly because of his voracious reading habits, his brazen and at times plain naive social skills, and because of the Hat's peculiar reaction to whatever was in Gaara's head. What was a strange sight quickly turned unsettling when Gaara didn't move in 5, 10, 15 minutes. He sat perfectly still, his eyes staring straight forward, blinking only occasionally. Of course, no one approached to see if he was all right. They were more than happy to wait for Draco, their resident Gaara handler, to come and address the issue. Finally a booming knock hit the hidden door to Slytherin and a couple of the lower years started to panic, loudly exclaiming that Sirius Black was there. A few of the more senior, sensible students started to sweat when Gaara finally moved and approached the threat. He looked fearless in the face of. Outside of the common room stood Rubeus Hagrid, the least threatening professor in the school by popular vote. As the undeniably strange pair walked away, the Slytherins breathed out another sigh of relief and wished for the 100th time that Gaara had burdened another house with his insanity. Their walk up through the castle wasn't plagued by inane small talk, for which Gaara was immensely grateful. He had noticed since he stopped talking that other people often tried to fill the silence with their own voices. An awkward reflex, he imagined, but nonetheless annoying. However, perhaps because of his penchant for working with animals, or because of his simple nature, Hagrid had an estimable appreciation of prolonged silence. When they got to Hagrid's hut, he offered Gaara a cup of tea and a fresh homemade cake. He accepted the first but declined the latter. He had experienced the giant man's baking before and imagined he would carry a fragment in his gut for years to come. The tea was no delicacy either, far too strong and using some of the generic heavy tea leaves he understood were common in this country. He longed for some real tea, not overcooked, not using these tasteless leaves, and not smelling of the whiskey that had undoubtedly filled the mug before it. Nevertheless, he thanked the man for the tea and began to sip it, waving off the offers of milk and honey. "Thanks for coming and having a cuppa tonight, Gaara. I've been a bit lonely lately, what with everyone on the lookout for old Sirius Black. Even the other professors have been too busy to come and pay a visit." Gaara nodded along passively. "I would have asked Harry, Ron and Hermione to come as well, but since Harry is a target of Sirius Black, it's too dangerous for him to leave the castle at night, even with a professor." Gaara could understand that, even if it was a little silly. Sirius was likely going to hug Harry when he next saw him, which he would agree was a cruel and evil aspiration. And the other students are too afraid of him and of the Dementors to come. So it's just been me and old Fang out here. Hagrid had finally mentioned the dog still drooling over Gaara's lap as the surly boy ignored it. "I got to admit, I have another reason for asking you out here tonight," Hagrid said, taking another swig of his own drink which smelled of anything but tea. "I know you've been looking after Fluffy lately and I wanted to say thank you." Gaara perked up, wondering how much he would have to admit to. "He's awful big, but he gets real lonely out there on his own. I'm glad you go out there and play with him, even if you're not strictly supposed to. I know you can look after yourself, no one who couldn't would be able to play with something as big as Fluffy. I expect you went looking for him after I told you and Professor Lupin about him. Don't blame you, either, you don't hear about a great big three-headed dog every day." Gaara nodded. "He's an indoor pup, really, but he can't stay in the school anymore. He was scratching the floors and chasing cats. And McGonagall was afraid he might go for a student, so they told me to find him a new home before the new term. I sent Norbert away. I couldn't get rid of Fluffy too. He's never known anyone but me." Gaara calmly sipped his tea. "So I asked Professor Dumbledore, I did. I asked him very nicely if Fluffy could stay in the forest, away from the kids and I would make sure he didn't get into no trouble. He bugged the centaurs and the thestrals for a bit, but he leaves them alone now." Hagrid had been excitedly drinking his tea as he talked, never more at home than when he was discussing one of his precious animals. What Gaara didn't tell Hagrid, and had no intention of telling him unless forced, was that he now considered Fluffy his. Hagrid had left him in the woods and Gaara had found him. He didn't care for the animal or anything like that, he just figured he would come in handy at some point. Gaara had secretly wanted a summoning animal for a little while now, but couldn't find anyone willing to let him sign their contract. He hadn't asked Timari, though, since the incident with Hakama Itachi's sister was still fresh in everybody's memories. Unfortunate. Though, the centaurs have been a touch rowdy lately. Suppose I don't blame them, really, with all the Dementors out and about. Plus they've never been happy about Professor L. Hagrid stumbled, looking right at Gaara to check if he had noticed the slip, about the cold lately. Hagrid settled himself back in his chair, happy that he had avoided spilling the beans on Remus. "I can imagine," Gaara's sand added. "Those nasty buggers have been upsetting just about everyone around here. My hippogriffs are usually such a lovely bunch," Gaara scoffed at that, "but now I can't let them anywhere near the student in case they attack them." Hagrid's strange interests, obliviousness aside, Gaara did agree that the Dementors that were once a nuisance had become a real danger since the beginning of the term. More and more he was finding strays wandering the forest a mile away from the demarcated patrols they should have been following around Hogwarts perimeter. A couple more in the next few months would wander near the Quidditch pitch, and then not long after that they would catch the scent of all of those anxious and emotional teenagers in the castle and... Well, Gaara wasn't entirely sure even he could stop that many of them at once. He would have spoken to the headmaster about these concerns, but one look at the man's wrinkled face over the past couple of months had said all he needed to hear. Dumbledore knew all too well how dangerous the current situation was, and for once the blame could not be laid at Sirius' dirty feet. Gaara stayed for a little under an hour with the lonely groundskeeper, discussing, one-sidedly, issues both new and old. Hagrid had spent 8 minutes lamenting over the slaying of Slytherin's basilisk last year, since it had likely been the single largest snake to ever live. Gaara would have enjoyed the expression on Hagrid's face if the man could see Manda. Or any of the boss summons, come to think of it. At the end of the evening, Gaara politely declined the offer of baked treats to take back and share with his friends and said his goodbyes. It had been a nice enough way to spend an evening. Gaara wasn't a sentimentalist, really, but he appreciated that Hagrid was a kind man. The red-headed warrior had no desire to be surrounded by cloying acquaintances, but spending an hour or two with someone who so clearly wasn't a Slytherin was nice too. Relaxing. Draco was already asleep when he walked in, having taken an early night. Gaara could hardly be accused of being noisy, but even as silent as he was an intrusive presence in any room he entered. It was part of his intimidating/evil aura, he figured. These weren't observations Gaara had made about himself, mind you. Draco had flat out told him he was intrusive and scary. Gaara had just assumed these things were linked. A few days later, Gaara was on his regular rounds in the forest, killing the dementors that had strayed into his path and any Acromantulas unlucky enough to wander into his line of sight. He had decided after his recent conversation that he wouldn't harm Aragog or Mosage since they had been Hagrid's pets at one time, like Fluffy. He wasn't interested in stealing them or trying to teach them tricks, but he wasn't about to kill them either. Plus, he had already claimed one of Hagrid's pets, even if the man didn't know it yet, and didn't want to go around killing the rest. The other Acromantulas, though, like the one that had cornered him on the full moon, were fair game in his eyes. An abundant and killable resource like the Dementors. He was circling around their territory, looking for some of the larger stragglers, when he heard a thumping on the ground. It was too frequent and soft for Fluffy, not to mention miles away from where the dog usually roamed. Moments later, after Gaara had called his son to attention, a pair of large adult centaurs galloped into the area, drawing their bows as soon as they saw him. They circled around him, but he didn't trouble himself about that. An arrow from the back was as dangerous to him as from the front. He wasn't worried. He waited until they had finished surrounding him before crossing his arms. If they shot an arrow, he would get to hunt something new and more humanoid. Shukaku would be thrilled. Neither of the two males loosed an arrow. Instead, one of them trotted forward and introduced himself. "Hello, I am Firenze. We have been looking for you, Gaara." Gaara nodded. "My people have tried to avoid you since you came to this land many moons ago. You are host to a great evil, and that maliciousness permeates the air around you. For those who can comprehend it, you are suffocating to be near. For those of lesser awareness, you can be alluring. The hungry wolf to the hunter, and the playful dog to the foal." Gaara had to readjust his arms lest that uncross in shock. He wasn't so sure what the last comment about the dog had meant, but he gathered that these horse people had somehow stumbled upon his secret. He might have killed the bear, just to be safe, but that would entail massacring the rest of the centaurs as well. Why couldn't they have just tried to kill him or something? It was never simple. "We do not know what you are, the stars have been unclear, but we know you are a stranger to this place, to our stars, and you have a role to play here." "A role?" Both of the creatures flinched when the sand moved, but the one named Firenze spoke again. "I am sorry. I do not read the human language." Gaara sighed. This was a new and irritating addition to his muteness. "There is disagreement in our people as to what you mean to this world, but I have elected to come and meet with you, and to tell you what we know. Very soon you will be forced to bare your soul, and in so doing you will risk it." Gaara tuned out the following diatribe about which distant star or planet was in convergence with which. He had come out this night to blow off some steam and enjoy the night air. Instead he was being told about his destiny and the danger to his soul. If he wanted to listen to this sort of stuff, he would show up to more of his divinations lessons. "You are dangerous. You wear the skin of a boy but house you evil. The stars cannot offer guidance, so I have been allowed to pass our wisdom to you in the hope you might avert the disaster to come. Our paths will cross again." He spouted off more about Mars. "For that time I will try to learn the humans' writing, so that we may talk properly." Their message delivered, Gaara nodded his thanks. "Acceptance?" He nodded, since he couldn't effectively communicate any other way, and they trotted away again. Gaara turned 90 degrees and walked further into the Acromantula territory, hoping for a big one to try and eat him. This headache was only going to get worse, so he would have to work, kill through the pain. Classes returned to normal pretty quickly, the adolescent predispositions towards drama allowing them to move from angry, to amused, to afraid, and back to the baseline angst within the space of a couple of days. Fear and anticipation still floated in the air, but now the student body were focusing on upcoming events. Some were interested in the summer holidays only a few months away, some, Ravenclaw and Hermione Granger, were eagerly awaiting the end-of-year exams that others were dreading, and some were focused solely on the scheduled Quidditch finals between Gryffindor and Slytherin. The match was certainly the most discussed in the Great Hall, as far as Gara could hear. Their third matchup this year, apparently even the Minister of Magic was considering attending. Draco was supporting his house by turning a sickly shade of green whenever the match was brought up. The teachers had throughout the year, and most of their careers, worked to focus their students on their schoolwork and not the myriad of distracting events and activities around the school. Other than the aforementioned group that were happily working and revising for the tests in May and June, the rest were either in denial about it or planning to deal with the issue closer to the date. Draco was in the latter group, procrastinating and worrying about the wrong things. He was still stressed about his exams, not that he let anybody outside of their room know, but with the massively important Quidditch match, the ongoing Sirius Black Dementor problem, and the looming specter of returning to his parents, Reed his father, for the entire protracted summer, he just couldn't put his mind to task. Guy wasn't worried, though. He was a bookish person by nature, though he certainly didn't take any real pride in that fact. In his world, it had been entirely leisurely to sit and read, even about maths or history. He hadn't even been tested to become a genin, so sure his father was that he would be an effective killing machine. He had been doing very little, reading, trying to play by himself, and then one day he was introduced to his estranged siblings and told he would be going on missions with them. When he had been told those missions might include killing, he was sold. So Gara continued to read like the books were going off, but the exams themselves were mere inconveniences for him. That said, his professors were not so blasé about his chances. His academics were not in question, other than whether he would be amongst or at the top of his year, but his practical skills were still well below average. In terms of raw power, he had more than Harry Potter or Neville Longbottom put together, but his utter lack of control or natural talent for magic had left him with the spell-casting ability of a first year. He wasn't injuring people with every spell he cast now, luckily, but he took a long time to learn any new spells and no one was sure if he was going to be up to passing into the next year. It was an exceptionally rare thing, being held back a year at Hogwarts. Almost as rare as a transfer student, but some of the teachers were not ruling it out. Gara had no natural talent and a very late start, so a few argued that it would be best for him to be held back a year. Some, Snape included, rebutted that it was a very harsh move to make since he had been slowly catching up, plus some people didn't want Gara staying in Hogwarts for an extra year. As a result, excepting Snape, most of Gara's professors began giving him extra help and the occasional remedial lesson. Lupin felt quite gratified that others were following his example, finally, even if they didn't have to contend with the ongoing antagonism between Gara and Harry. The two boys had not come so close to blows since the beginning of their shared tutorials, but there was still clearly no love lost. It didn't help that Harry was showcasing a prodigious talent for his spell work in front of Gara, who was struggling with the spells they had learned in a week in October. In between his regular Dada tutoring, his reading, killing arachnids and dementors, occasional training, homework, these new remedial lessons, and the time he set aside for Fluffy, Gara was very busy in April. On the bright side, it had given him the perfect excuse to ditch Luna and Draco when the mood struck, which was far more frequent with the former, who now wanted to do nothing but discuss his lamentable monthly form. "Your ears are rather long. Do they help your hearing?" Luna asked as she matched his quickened pace. Gara nodded, not wanting anyone to see his words if they couldn't already hear hers. "You still haven't told me how you ended up that way. I've tried to read about Tanuki, but they don't appear anywhere outside of Japan, and they don't look that much like you. You weren't scratched by one, were you? Gaara shook his head, enduring these questions for the millionth time. Luna was obsessive. I wish my father could have seen you. But now that I know it's you, and you don't want people to know, I suppose he won't get to see you in that form. The question was there, even if there was no inflection. Gaara shook his head firmly. He didn't really feel a need to meet his tenuous friend's father, and certainly did not feel compelled to reveal his dark secret to the man. He didn't particularly like Luna knowing, and he would prefer she never find out about the not-so-cute tanuki inside of him. Allowing his sand to emerge, Gaara wrote, I have to go to class now. Oh, okay. Luna said in stride, then she took a look out of the parallel window curiously. It's night time, you know. I have an extra lesson with Professor McGonagall. Oh. Luna actually sounded a little jealous. Gaara correctly deduced that he shouldn't let it be known to any other Ravenclaws that he was being offered extra time with the teachers out of hours. Jealousy is a horrid thing, and without the friendship Luna had with Gaara, it might have brought out some of Ravenclaw's less desirable characteristics. With his time divided in a dozen different ways, time flew by quicker and quicker until the only meaningful marker of his time came around again. His/Draco's calendar had told him what was coming, but he still struggled with what to do. He had to do something. The more he thought about cooping himself up during the full moon, the crazier it sounded. If his human mind rebelled at the idea, he would end up chewing off his own fur when his animal mind kicked in. He knew he could count on Luna's assistance, but despite the ensured safety staying the night near her would bring, there were obvious drawbacks to that route and he wasn't willing to walk down that path. The promised measurements and drawings alone were enough reason to avoid her that night. Continuing his tradition of flip-flopping, he ended up in the forest that evening, going through his routine preparations. By the time the moon had risen and he had transformed, he was almost finished with his current book. He fumbled and struggled putting the bookmark in place with his clumsy, yet opposable, paw digits. Gaara had taken the time to map out the safer areas in the Forbidden Forest so that he might avoid the dangerous spiders, overly affectionate thestrals, troublesome centaurs, and Fluffy. It had left him with two relatively clear areas, so he had taken the area further away from the castle, where Hagrid wasn't likely to stumble across him. Gaara had learned that climbing trees in this form was a fun challenge since the form clearly wasn't designed to perform the task. He could dig holes easily enough, though he tended not to since it covered his paws in dirt, but scaling any sort of tree was a difficult task. He was halfway up a particularly flat oak trunk when he heard a dangerous and familiar growling. He turned his head but wasn't able to turn it around far enough to see the werewolf, so he ended up bending it backwards and seeing the energetic wolf pacing about the clearing, looking right at the small creature trying to climb the tree. He knew the werewolf didn't pose any danger to him in this form, for whatever reason, but being around the wolf didn't bring out a palatable side of Gaara. He had time after their last encounter to lament his playing with another person-turned-animal. He knew his mind worked differently in this body, but he didn't want to give in to the indignity. Not without a fight. That said, when the wolf let out an impatient woof, Gaara dropped off of the tree and trotted over to the larger mammal. They promptly began a game of tag. Over the course of the night, they played tag, hide and seek, which was harder since they could smell the other, play fighting, and they also just ran around the forest. They didn't encounter any acromantulas, which was a shame because Gaara wanted to see his Luna friend savage one of them. They did, however, run afoul of a single centaur patrolling the edge of their territory, most likely specifically to keep out the werewolf. The adolescent man-horse fired an arrow at the pair of them, which was enough to have Gaara running in the opposite direction. He saw the irony in this situation after his thoughts a couple of weeks ago when the two fully grown centaurs had brandished their bows at him. The wolf looked ready to run at the centaur, heedless of the danger, but followed after Gaara as soon as the tanuki had darted away. That was the most perilous of dramatic thing to happen during the night, making it one of the most peaceful ones Gaara had experienced since this whole mess had begun. As the sky was lightening, Gaara had been waiting for the werewolf to run away and leave him to go and retrieve his clothes. As soon as he tried to leave, the wolf would follow, so he ended up following the creature around the general vicinity of his clothes for a while, growing more and more anxious that his transformation would take place before the other afflicted male. He didn't think his wolfish companion would be so affable when Gaara was in his human body. Though, if he had his sand nearby, it wouldn't matter much anyway. They stopped in a clearly only 100 meters away from his own, when the wolf sat back and then started to howl. Unlike any of the happy howls or communicative ones Gaara had heard during the night, this was clearly one of agony, signaling his time to go. He transformed just before he reached the area where he had hid his clothes, marking this as a particularly close call. He threw on his uniform quickly and ran back the way he had come as soon as his sand was on his back. The werewolf was still mostly canine by the time he returned. Obviously werewolf transformations, unlike his own, did not get easier with time. By the looks of things, the transformations must have gotten worse over the years. It was painful to watch and worse to listen to, Gaara thought. It certainly would make an interesting conversation with Professor Lupin when he next saw him. The Dada teacher had likely never seen what Gaara was now witnessing. Of course, in a matter of minutes, that thought was derailed as he saw the wolf's snout snap back onto a comparably flat human face. A recognizable face, at that. Gaara leaned against a tree, the shock actually taking its toll. Of all the people in the world, it just had to be Remus. If he habitually swore, Gaara would have then. Instead, he mimed not so silently, typical. Followed by a heavy cough, and an experimental ow. His throat hurt a great deal, and he could feel his voice weakening the more he used it, but it was working. He wanted to test it even more, but as the feeling had indicated, his voice was fading as fast as it had returned, as the next time he tried speaking it came out as nothing more than a croak, still wonderfully audible, but not intelligible. He didn't have time to be dwelling on this encouraging trend, as Lupin would not be much longer, so instead he waited a few more moments for Lupin to finish changing and to cover himself, before walking towards him. No one would know the tanuki creature that roamed the grounds spent the rest of the month as a human, so Gaara didn't need to worry about any association with it when he approached the visibly exhausted man. The rustling of the leaves at his feet alerted the man to his presence, and he looked up, took a good long look at Gaara's impassive face, and uttered an "oh." His croaky voice and trembling knees were not an impressive sight, nor was his half-naked body, covered in scars showing his ribs. Gaara knew his own was no pretty sight, so he pitied the man briefly, before darting forward and stopping him collapsing. How long have you been here?" Remus said, looking even more pathetic than when Gaara had carried his drunken body back to his office. Gaara stared at him, thinking that Lupin's absences and appearance around the full moon made a lot more sense now. He felt himself rather lucky in that regard, as he was fully functional, whereas Lupin would have likely taken the better part of an hour to put on his clothes, let alone the time it would take to return to the castle, which had to be at least 3 miles away. Lupin squinted, looking at the sand as it formed words. The morning after the night before was clearly affecting him in every possible respect. "I saw you transform back from being a werewolf." He figured he would cut to the heart of the matter. "Oh, right. Well, then I think we will need to talk about this. But not until I am wearing substantially more clothes." While he wasn't as friendly as drunk Remus, post-werewolf Remus was remarkably similar in a number of other regards. It was difficult to watch the grown man struggle so much to put on a shirt, doubly so with the added grunting and groaning he made. When he was attired, Gaara helped him to stand and then to walk. It took only 100 meters for Gaara to get frustrated by Lupin's constant stumbling and noise-making and throw the full-grown man onto his sand to carry him. Regaining his bearings, Remus thanked Gaara for his harsh kindness, settling into the sand stretcher for the ride. As you will know from class, werewolves transmit their disease with a bite. What we didn't cover was that these are not always random, animalistic attacks. My father said some unkind things about werewolves in front of an evil man one day when I was a young boy. This terrible man was a proud werewolf named Fenrir Greyback who decided to teach my father a lesson by attacking me. He snuck into my room at night and before my father could drive him off, he bit me. I was 5 years old at the time. Lupin was drifting dangerously close to reminiscing, Gaara thought. Of course, there was no cure for it, so I have had to transform every month since I was 5. When I got to school, for the first couple of years at least, Professor Dumbledore was the only one who knew about my condition. Gaara thought long and hard about the fact that Lupin had had to undergo such painful changes for so many years. Not to compare them, but Gaara found himself considering whether it would be less humiliating to turn into a wolf rather than a tiny tanuki. Sure, there was obviously pain, but he wouldn't have to worry about being attacked, or briboned, just worry about eating the occasional sheep or mauling villagers. Professor Dumbledore helped me a lot back then. He made sure I was able to transform safely away from everyone else. This was before the wolfspan potion had been invented, you understand. Gaara wondered how Lupin would act, in his werewolf form, if he hadn't taken the potion. Werewolves were apparently incredibly aggressive when untreated, even to their friends, family, or companionable tanuki they would otherwise like to play with. Did you transform out here back then as well? Gaara asked. No, Professor Dumbledore was kind enough to provide me with a safe place to do it. I was too young to walk through the dark forest alone before and after the change, especially as it always leaves me so weak, so he used a little of the school's funds to purchase a run-down property and then had a tunnel constructed to allow me to get there and back without anybody noticing. It was the Shrieking Shack that he got for me. I would go there and transform alone and then be back in the morning before anyone noticed I was missing. There used to be all sorts of wards on the shack to stop me getting out, but they've all long since faded. I expect Dumbledore's completely forgotten about the Shrieking Shack by now. There's a tunnel? Gaara would have been indignant, having walked miles through the forest in the snow and the rain to visit Sirius, if he thought it might register with Lupin who was still in the throes of his lycanthropic hangover. Oh, yes. About that. I would have mentioned it earlier you see, but you tend to draw attention to yourself, and we couldn't afford for anyone to notice you near the Homping Willow. If they find out about the shack, Sirius will have nowhere to go. Gaara sighed. It was by no means his speciality, that was true, but he was still a ninja. He could, if the need arose, sneak past some teenagers and untrained civilian adults. Sure, there was the need for secrecy, but on the other hand he still had some pride left. I am a trained warrior. I can sneak past anyone here. Lupin was sure Gaara was bragging, but there was no way to be sure when Gaara's face refused to show the smallest smirk or upturned nose. Perhaps you're right. At least you seem to draw less attention these days, so I don't see any harm in telling you anymore. Under the Homping Willow. The violent tree near Hagrid's home? Yes, the Homping Willow is rather ill-tempered. The trick is to touch the knotted root at its base, that will open the passageway into the shack. Sirius keeps watch of the front garden to make sure no one is coming, so be sure to give him a good scare when you next go and visit him. The weakened smile on Lupin's face was less endearing and more alarming. It didn't come as that great a surprise that Remus was a werewolf. There were warning signs after all, that he had missed because of his own lunar issues. Still, knowing that his friend had been suffering for so long without respite was sad. Lupin's smile dropped suddenly off of his face when he realized he had missed a prime opportunity for mischief. He could have told Gaara to do all manner of humiliating things when he pressed the knot, like flapping his arms or hopping in place, or so many regrets. "Why were you in the forest so early, Gaara?" "I have been in here all night. I was monitoring the Dementors." "Yes, monitoring. I'm sure. After what Hagrid has told me, I suspect you have been monitoring the Acromantulas as well." Gaara's impassive face looked anywhere but at Lupin at that point. Just a coincidence. He carried Lupin until they reached the tree line, before he helped Lupin to stand again, and they both limped back up the hill and into the castle. There was nobody around this early in the morning, so Gaara took him all the way up to the strung-out man's office again. While he had what amounted to superhuman strength and speed, his stamina was one of the worst in Sunagakure, a trait that he had been trying to train out of himself for months. By the time they got to the Dada classroom and adjoined office, Gaara was sweating and cursing the four founders for making a school with so many stairs. He dumped Lupin, conscious this time, with no more care or gentleness than when he had, literally, dropped Lupin off after his drinks on Gaara's birthday. The groans and grunt he got in response were all the thanks Gaara needed, so he left the pained man to recover a little before the day ahead. He needed to change his own clothes before breakfast. He smelled like the forest, which sounded nice in theory, the smell of nature, etc., but really he just smelled like moss and dirt. As he walked down the familiar path to the dungeons, Gaara's hand snuck up to rub out the scar on his neck, his fingers running across the smooth surface of the largest and deepest gouge in his throat. With his hand still between his Hittite and his neck, he tried again to speak, but all he got was a squeak before he felt something give. What followed out his mouth were garbled and harsh whispers, incomprehensible even to his own ears, but they were audible. He didn't miss a step, but he did smile as he walked. His throat was healing during these full moon transformations, whether over the course of the night or during the changes themselves. He didn't know. Still, at least Shikaku was finally making himself useful. Or, what did his Konoha counterpart term the exchange of chakra for housing inside of a Jinchuriki? Ah yes, Shikaku was paying rent, at last. Absolute defense, notwithstanding. That screaming, whining, irksome beast was due a visit sometime soon, he supposed. If only to confirm that this world's peculiar effect on the seal had not changed it further. Of course, Gaara didn't let on to Draco that his throat was on the mend, for the usual reasons of pointless secrecy. That, and he didn't want to draw any additional unnecessary attention towards himself. Madame Pomfrey had promised to not speak about any of his scars or other abnormalities, but he didn't intend to make her privy to any more secrets than he had to, including his inexplicable, and slow, regeneration. He needed to guard himself against over-reliance on the people of this world. At breakfast, clothed in a fresh uniform, Gaara watched with new eyes as Lupin struggled to his seat, as he had every month since Gaara had known him. It made him feel a bit of a dunce now that he knew for sure that Lupin had displayed these obvious signs all the while and Gaara had never put them together. He took solace in the fact that no one else probably had either. It was almost mesmerizing, watching the man struggle to eat his cereal, his hands shaking most of the milk and shredded wheat off his spoon before it reached his mouth. He was broken from his reverie when he noticed Draco was staring at him, obviously wondering what Gaara's fascination with their Dada professor was. Not intending to give the game away, he wrote, "I believe Professor Trelawney has poured alcohol into her orange juice again." Draco looked to the head table, and predictably the divinations professor was already looking drunk, which could have been because she was indeed sneaking drinks at breakfast or because she was still drunk from last night's bender. Gaara hadn't rushed to test his new path off of the school grounds, in part because he wanted to find a new area of research and that was taking up an inordinate amount of his time, and part because he had had no luck in finding Pettigrew, and it was a shameful defeat for a trained professional like himself. That said, The opportunity for mischief Lupin had mentioned was too rich to pass up when Draco invited him out for a Hogsmeade visit. It was always on Draco's invitations that Gara went to the nearby village, since Gara had no burning desire to be around people, because Gara was entirely broke and occasionally he needed new stationery or other items only available through the generous charity of Lucius Malfoy's second largest drain on his wallet. Draco was always happy to buy Gara the things he needed, since that amount didn't account for even a tenth of Draco's allowance. But Gara normally had to drag his generous friend out of shops before he started buying useless items for him too. What on earth would he need a cane for anyway? Even if it was imbued with lightweight charms and would be his size. With the opportunity here, Gara sent Draco on ahead with the permitted students whilst he waited for the coast to clear for him to take what he imagined would amount to a nice little shortcut, if Lupin was to be believed. He didn't know if he would be angry or impressed if Lupin had managed to trick him during his sorry state that morning. Sure, it would be quite the feat to make a joke when the man could barely stand, but then Gara had to weigh that against the real danger his proximity to the great big, violent tree would place him in. All that said, he was nervous approaching the willow tree's base, eyes ever watchful for any sudden movements. With a great deal more luck than judgment, he made it to the prominent and presumptive special knot he was looking for. He wondered if his mysterious effect on the simple-minded creatures of this world, that the centaur had mentioned, had also ensured him safe passage past this surly tree. Inside was nothing more extraordinary than a narrow, low-ceilinged dirt tunnel largely maintained by the roots that occasionally hung down from the otherwise unsupported roof. He stumbled along, barely having to lower his head in the low ceiling thanks to his unimpressive height, his hands feeling the walls in the dark. It must have been only a mile as soon after he felt a small incline begin. He was underneath a wooden trap door. He pushed up the wood slowly and quietly, immediately recognizing the rotted downstairs hallways of the Shrieking Shack. He used all of his considerable stealth skills to move upstairs, utilizing his expertise to navigate the creaky floorboards, which were the majority, to get to the front bedroom. In this sat Sirius, watching the woods beyond the edge of the property intently. Gara walked up behind Sirius and waited. It was 5 minutes of watching Sirius watch the outside before the man shifted a little and rolled his neck to ease the tension, inadvertently catching a glimpse of Gara. Ugh! Sirius fell off of the bed he had been perched on, having turned almost as pale as Gara himself. Sirius stayed prone on the floor for a few moments to catch his breath, all the while staring up at the smirking redhead who had taken the time and the effort to sneak up on him. What, why, and there, how? Sirius' mind took a while to boot back up, before he finally sighed, smiled behind his thick convict's beard and perked up. Nicely done. He congratulated the prank well executed. How on earth did you get in here? I barricaded all of the back entrances. Wait, you haven't broken any of the walls down, have you? Gara shook his head. Mooney told me about the secret passage under the violent tree. He did he? Well, I hope he also didn't suggest this little idea? Gara shook his head very slowly. Right. Sirius clearly didn't believe it, but he could plan his revenge on the both of them later. He had all the time in the world, these days. Well, it was about time he did. I wanted to tell you about it all along, but Mr. Mooney Pants was concerned you would lead everyone and their mothers there. Gara didn't pout. He told me after I saw him transform after the full moon. Oh. Sirius was wide-eyed, and entirely serious for the moment. Well, that would do it. I suppose it's good that you know. That sort of secret can be hard to maintain, and a burden halved is a burden. Wait, no. A burden shared is a burden halved. That's it. Gara nodded, he supposed it made sense. What he had meant to be a short visit mostly for the sake of scaring Sirius lasted more than an hour, with Sirius falling back into nostalgic reminiscence as he was prone to do. He told of how he and James, and Peter, had discovered Remus closely guard's secret and had undertaken their animagus training to join on those full moon without risking attack or infection. As it turned out, werewolves could be trusted to play nice with their animal friends, even without the wolfsbane potion. When Gara did finally make his excuses, a nice description of what would usually be a tactful lie, not what Gara had said, "I'm leaving. You are boring me," he found Draco drinking Butterbeer in the Hogshead pub. "I thought you said you were going to beat me here today? I've been waiting for half an hour. I got held up." He sat down and started sipping the drink Draco had ordered him while he waited. It was actually the second such drink. The first he had ordered had sat there while he waited and finished his own drink, so he had ended up drinking Gara's and ordering another for his wayward friend. That day, Harry had also snuck into Hogsmeade, using his invisibility cloak to follow Ron and Hermione through the village, and taking a good few minutes to quietly laugh to themselves at Draco Malfoy, who had sat in the pub for 20 minutes on his own with a drink for a non-existent friend. Granted, their schadenfreude lasted only as long as Malfoy's solitude did. After Gara showed up, the trio quickly departed since they had a bad habit of being caught staring by Gara, and this time they wouldn't have the entirety of the Great Hall of the Professor to mitigate the awkward hostility. The trip was uneventful for all involved, barring one sixth-year girl who had had a fight with her boyfriend and had wandered to the edge of the village to cry alone. Thankful McGonagall had sensed the shift in temperature immediately and had taken off running after the distraught girl. Still, if the battle-hardened woman had been even a minute late, she might not have been able to cast the Patronus in time to save Andrea Bennett's soul. As a result, and with a heavy heart, Dumbledore announced the indefinite suspension of weekend Hogsmeade visits until such a time as they could ensure the students' safety. The proclamation over dinner had the expected effect, with almost every student third year and up loudly complaining about the decision. Amongst those not verbally abusing the kindly professor were a number of disinterested Ravenclaws, those like Harry who had not had their permission slips signed, Gara for the previous two reasons and the other obvious cause for not shouting, and the friends of Miss Bennet, who had been called away from the girls' hospital bedside for dinner. Gara wasn't that upset about the restriction, being that he wasn't allowed to go anyway, but this latest attack was yet more proof of the Dementor threat. Even worse, Sirius had hinted at his increasing frenzy. The man was becoming impatient like never before, panicking that he would lose his chance over the summer, or the Dementor patrols would catch him before then. With those patrols moving closer to the edge of the Hogwarts boundary and further into Hogsmeade, it would only be a matter of time until they were regularly passing by the shack. Sirius could hide as a dog for a limited time, but eventually they would catch him out. Gara decided that evening that he would forego his research for the time being and focus entirely on finding Wormtail over the next couple of months. If the rat was in the school, Gara was going to find him. "He's in your gourd?" Lupin asked, caught between amused and alarmed. Gara nodded, not proud of the part he was playing. "You've done this before, though." Gara nodded again. It was much easier this time, sneaking Sirius onto the grounds. The Shrieking Shack passage had made his visiting the agitated criminal many times easier, and then carrying him back into the school that many times simpler too. However, with the increase in turnout from politicians, families and the like, subsequent security increases, and the unprecedented number of student spectators, the stadium was filled to its magical capacity, and it was only by the grace of the kindly Professor Lupin that Gara had been able to get in at all. Sadly, he did not have ample space to set up a viewing box for Sirius and he again. Instead Sirius would have to kneel or sit as a dog in the gourd and watch over Gara's shoulder. It was the first time, in the crowded stands, that Gara had ever gotten a truly dirty look for carrying his gourd with him. Apparently the other teenagers around him didn't appreciate the oversized container pushing against them. Gara noticed that in the stands next to Dumbledore, Snape, McGonagall and Lucius was Minister Cornelius Fudge. He actually asked himself if killing the bumbling politician would help Sirius or his own situation at all. The answer he came to was no. It would probably worsen at least Sirius' situation, his being the likely prime suspect and all. Still, a boy could dream. Draco's nerves had convinced Gaara that the blonde should never hold a high-stress job, since the boy fell to pieces when the expectations of those around him manifested openly. Another reason Gaara had been late picking Sirius up and thus late to the stadium was that he had to coax Draco out of their room and towards the changing room before the game. He'd thought it before and he would do so again. Draco would make a terrible shinobi. Imagine if he were assigned to assassinate somebody. Still, being as important a game as Gaara understood it to be, he hadn't even bothered to bring a book for when he inevitably got bored of the sport. Instead he would suffer the lengthy game in silence, and perhaps meditate with his eyes open in the middle. These games were the one time he prayed for the Dementors to attack the children. Just some purposeful excitement to interrupt the monotonous passing of the ball, flying around, on stupid and dangerous flying contraptions, and then so-called impressive acrobatic displays. If they did these movements without the brooms, Gaara might have been impressed. Gaara had been very firm with Sirius that the man-dog was not to howl, scream, cheer or make any noise, supportive or not, during the match, and that if he did Gaara would leave and take Sirius home. Sirius had been properly cowed, luckily, as it was a largely empty threat. Gaara couldn't possibly risk Draco noticing he'd left. It bugged him that the Minister of Magic had brought with him a number of Ras to protect him, including a few Lupin had indicated were specialists from Azkaban. Fudge didn't care when it was just children and teachers out here, but when he might be at risk of a stray Dementor or two, he brought an extra dozen Wranglers for his own protection. He was worse than the daimyo. Being as tense as they were, as soon as Hooch released the different balls and blew the whistle, every player on a broom flew into a frenzy, flying in rapid and aerobatic maneuvers, trying to start with the upper hand. Gaara watched only Draco as the blonde finished his initial sweep of the stadium's airspace, and settled high up, on the far side of the area to his father and the other VIPs. He looked panicked already, his head moving around rapidly. Gaara thought his friend was going to give himself whiplash. The quaffle was passed around as energetically as it ever had been, goals being scored on either side within 10 minutes of commencement. All the while, Gaara's eyes glazed over. Inside of his mindscape, he headed down into the cave where he knew he could find his foul-mouthed and tempered tenant stapled to the wall. As expected, he found Shukaku on the wall, no longer screaming without respite, only occasionally yelling an expletive at his neglectful host. "Well, look who we have here. The Crown Prince has descended to talk to us poor demons. What do I owe this pleasure to, oh tiny one? I need to check if the seal has changed again. Why, do you think it's to do with your ugly, scratchy voice coming back?" The giant sand tanuki spoke with such glee and malice, Gaara knew he wouldn't get a single straight answer out of the monster, no matter that the Baji might know exactly what was happening. The seal itself was exactly as it had been the last time he had bothered to bodily come down here. He hadn't expected any different. Shukaku would have almost certainly alerted him to any changes, whether more comforting or painful, if they had taken place. Gaara didn't stay long in his mind, the company of his demon even less appealing than staring into the sky to watch his friend waste precious hours and energy chasing flying orbs around. He didn't bother saying goodbye to the ill-mannered tanuki, disappearing without warning to look out of his own eyes again. Sure enough, the brooms were still flying and Gaara was stuck there. Every now and then there would be a sudden flurry of activity and the announcer would declare that one of the teams had scored another 10 points, more often than not being Slytherin in this match. He could feel Sirius banging on his gourd, obviously suppressing his cheers of angry exclamations whenever Gryffindor did anything, or one of the Slytherin players were less than gentlemanly. That was one thing Gaara appreciated about Draco in these matches. He played by the same sportsmanlike rules and etiquette as his opponent. While doing that in battle was foolhardy and proud, doing so in a straight contest was honorable. Or so he gathered from one of Rock Lee's numerous impassioned speeches about his sensei. With that in mind, it was a little painful to watch the obvious difference in natural athletic ability between Draco and Harry Potter. Or, more so, Potter's A's were clearly better at tracking the elusive snitch than Draco's, whereas the Slytherin was probably a little more physically able. But in a game where their purpose was to track and catch a small, almost invisible flying sphere around a rather large area, Harry's eyes had the edge on Draco's minor athletic advantage. The match was the longest Gara had been to, and was in fact the most protracted of the year's season, which made it feel immeasurably longer to the suffering teen amongst the throngs of cheering peers. He had taken to full meditation, staying out of his mindscape and going deeper to a dreamlike state in order to escape the mind-numbing monotony of what others championed as the height of excitement. He was only jostled out of his not-quite thoughts when the people surrounding him had taken to jumping and screaming at the top of their lungs. Gara would not have believed beforehand that they had been using anything but the full extent of their lung capacities. Now back in reality, he looked around to see why the ruckus had escalated. The game was over and had been called. He was briefly confused as he was in the Slytherin section of the stands, and all around him were celebrating whereas the Gryffindors were looking much less enthused. This would have been self-explanatory were it not for the absolutely sullen look on Draco's face that Gara could see from dozens of meters away. As it transpired, Slytherin had soared ahead in the points and had managed to accrue 230 compared to Gryffindor's modest 70. Slytherin had the broom advantage still, and their beaters had been on top form, sabotaging many attempts at the Lions scoring through the hoops. It also helped that they had managed to disable their captain, keeper Oliver Wood, and the chaser Alicia Spinnet. They substituted in for the positions, but obviously the team were weakened because of it. With all of the point scoring going on, one-sidedly perhaps, the Seekers had been entirely ignorant of all of it. The only measure of time the two boys had was their straining and cramping muscles as they went from staying still to sprinting at top speed to where they had caught a glimpse of a flash of gold. A few times this ended up being a Gryffindor uniform to both of their ire. Finally, Harry had spotted the snitch closer to him than Draco, and his proximity and head start ensured that within second he had caught the snitch, ended the match and elicited the mixed cheers from all around. The Lions cheered their Seeker's ability and symbolic victory, while the Snakes cheered for their victory. The particularly Quidditch-obsessed among them had also worked out that Slytherin, as a consequence of their points in this and their other games, had just won the Quidditch Cup. Gara felt very sorry for Draco, whose team had just won the cup no thanks to him. He would have to think of something nice to do for his friend, or at least something that would serve to distract the distraught teenager. Speaking of distractions, he would need to start making his way through the crowds if he was to be there to intercept Lucius before he could spirit Draco away for a private word. He didn't need to see across the vast field to know what expression Lucius was liable to be wearing on his face at the present moment. He was working against the dense mass of people, most of which were taller than him, who wanted to stay and cheer a little longer at their team. He eventually made his way through the forest of torsos until he finally met with a gap and was able to move behind the students to the exit. Once outside, he ran straight for the changing rooms, halfway round the stadium. By the time he was nearing it, the other children were starting to leave the stands and make their ways back inside or towards the changing rooms as well. He stood guard outside of the door, more vigilant against his friend's father than the nosy teenagers or one or two grown men with cameras. He'd been told, at length, the dangers of the press in this country, world, and the power of the camera. It had come up after he had almost attacked a short Gryffindor boy who had taken his picture. He hadn't known that his picture was being taken, only that someone had run up to him with his box in front of their face and then shined a bright light in his eyes. In retrospect, Gara believed he had heard of cameras in his world, after a fashion, but he had never seen one nor had he been photographed by one. He had never needed a shinobi ID since everyone in his own village knew precisely who he was, and Suna hadn't wanted to broadcast the face of their Jinchuriki, especially before the ill-fated war against Konoha. Still, now that he was watching these men wielding their cameras like Overigagen in order to ambush an animal, he wondered whether he should not have dismissed Draco's warnings about these paparazzi offhand. The bulbs started flashing as soon as Mr. Malfoy strode around into view, followed by the perpetually red-faced Minister Fudge, and the handful of Ras guarding them. Gaara ducked into the changing rooms ahead of them, and looked around for Draco, who was the only one not smiling or getting changed. By the way he hung his head in shame, Gaara wondered if Draco might have even worse self-esteem issues than some Jinchuriki. With the approaching palaver, Gaara went straight to Draco's side and then stared straight at both Fudge and Lucius when they entered, daring the latter to come near Draco. Both the gentlemen offered their congratulations, along with Snape and Dumbledore, who entered after, who did likewise. The team were duly awed by the Minister of Magic visiting them personally after the game. "Well, I must say that was one of the most exciting Quidditch matches I have seen outside of the professional circuit," Fudge proclaimed, enunciating clearly for the man with the quill and pad of paper. "You have done your school and your country proud today." Dumbledore stayed well back, not wishing to upstage the politician with his own grandiose words of congratulation. "I wish I could be there to present you with your trophy, but I am afraid running Magical Britain must come first. Treasure your hard-earned victory and rest ahead of next year, though I expect I will see a number of you at the World Cup this summer. I'm sure any of you could be inspired to enter into professional Quidditch, if you do not have any more pressing ambitions." The Slytherin team were all exceptionally excited despite the hours they had been exerting themselves, and in the ruckus Gaara guided Draco over to the showers where he might freshen up and avoid his father. Gaara waited out in the changing room, but didn't get any strange looks beyond the one from Fudge. Lucius lingered after Fudge had left only a moment to see Draco was in the showers, and left looking contemptuous and frustrated. There would most definitely be a stern letter to follow. It was the better part of an hour later that Draco was ready to go back to the castle and forego dinner. They were almost upon the castle, not a word being spoke between them, that Gaara remembered he still had the most wanted man in Britain still trapped inside of his gourd. He gave serious thought to just keeping the mangy man in there for the time being, to keep him out of trouble and away from witnesses, but he wasn't sure he could be trusted to look after a pet. He would most likely forget to feed his captive. He told Draco to go on to their room, and he darted back to the Humping Willow to release the sweating, dehydrated, and disorientated convict. When said convict glared at him, trying to catch his breath, the only thing Gaara could think to write was "good game." That evening, while the rest of their house was celebrating, Draco had elected to stay in his room, lamenting his failure. Gaara had half-heartedly tried to argue that without Draco's efforts, Potter would have caught the snitch too early and Slytherin would have lost the match, and then their point count wouldn't have been enough to secure cup. So I'm a stall tactic. Draco was pretending to read a book, but unless he was trying to mimic Luna's ability to read upside down, he was probably just trying to look nonchalant. Gaara was actually reading, happy to stay out of the party raging amongst the other Slytherins. "His eyes are better than yours." It was a bad match-up, Gaara wrote, thinking how else he could cheer Draco up without lying. "If you trained more, you might beat him next time." Draco's eyes shot wide at that one word. No, that's okay. I don't need any more training, I think. Potter's just better than me. Perfect, popular, powerful, Potter. Gaara wanted to deny any of that, but other than the perfect, they all had a ring of truth. Draco wasn't deficient in any of those regards, but he was behind Potter in many aspects. "I didn't know you wanted to be like Potter so much." "What? I don't want to be like Potter. I want to be as far from like Potter as possible," Draco declared. Then you might want to focus on another sport. Or get better at Quidditch. And you are smarter than him." He didn't need to hesitate in that compliment. Potter was a bit of a dunce, all things considered. "So I might as well be a Ravenclaw?" Draco lamented. Gara thought back to times when he had been told about these sorts of tantrums. One particular tale came to mind, set in that small wave country. Following his more upbeat blonde friend's example, he walked up to Draco and punched him on the top of the head. Not hard enough to knock him out, but Draco did yell and clutch his now aching skull. What the hell was that for? Stop acting like a brat. He would have thought of something inspirational to say following the braining, but Gara was still a student of social life, so he let his comment hang in the air, figuratively speaking. "I'm not acting like a brat. Just leave me alone, for God's sake." Gara shook his head and sat back where he had been reading. He knew Draco was trapped here because he didn't want to emerge into the party going on right outside their door and didn't want to storm off into the bathroom like a crying teenage girl. So instead he nursed the soft spot on the top of his head and mourned his ill fate. The rest of the night was chilly to say the least, and Draco didn't deign to speak again, so the two moved about in silence during their morning routines. Draco quickly headed out as soon as he was ready, clearly still upset about how Gara had acted the day before. Gara, for his part, was trying to figure out what he was supposed to have done differently. Maybe he should have smiled at some point? Maybe shouting was required. He skipped breakfast, missing the entire Slytherin table warmly welcoming their seeker who they trumpeted as their salvation, allowing them to rack up enough points to not only beat their rivals but take the cup again. Draco avoided answering questions as to why he had skipped the party last night, and the ever-tactful house knew not to pry into one of their own and their bad moods. Draco's mood dipped even further after the morning post had been delivered and he had read through the short missive from his father threatening to have him pulled from the team if he didn't do better next time. He would not allow a Malfoy to make a fool of himself. At lunch, Gara was feeling hungry, but wanted to stay away from Draco until he could figure out his next move. He was saved by the unlikely hero of Luna, who showed up carrying a basket and an offer of a picnic. "Good afternoon, Gara. Would you like some lunch?" Gara weighed up his options. He was very hungry, but this course would require that he sit and eat with Luna, who was still taking every opportunity to discuss the form he so reviled. His stomach won out and he nodded, following as she strode out onto the sunny grounds. It was one of the warmest days he could remember having since he arrived in this world, so it was a pleasant enough day to eat in the otherwise unforgiving elements. "I haven't seen you in the Great Hall since dinner the night before last, so I thought you might be hungry," she explained, foregoing a blanket and sitting straight on the dry grass. Gara nodded. "You're avoided Draco, aren't you?" Gara nodded again. "You've been avoiding me as well." Gara thought for a second. He slowly nodded. "I thought as much. People usually avoid me. Ginny does it every now and then, especially if she's with her other friends. I think I embarrass her." When Gara looked up at her, she continued, "I don't think you care what other people think. You just don't like talking about yourself very much. That's okay." For a person just willfully admitting her only two friends both ditched her because they didn't want to be seen with her or didn't want to talk to her, Luna was remarkably unfazed. "Have you thought about trying to learn how to become an animagus?" Luna said, taking out some plates and sandwiches, both of which Gara quickly accepted. He thought about what she had said before. She knew he had been avoiding her because of these conversations and yet that was the first thing she wanted to talk about. She was either mistakenly placed in Ravenclaw, or she was sticking to her convictions. Impressive, and terribly frustrating. Though, she did raise an interesting question. "Animagus?" "Yes, so that you might control your transformations. I don't know if it would work, and you would need to find a teacher willing to help you, but it might be worth trying. At least until you find a way to go home." Professor McGonagall is a cat animagus, but Professor Lupin could probably get you started since you know him best. Gara thought about this. His best bet with a teacher would undoubtedly be Remus, but Sirius would be able to take him much further since he would be speaking from experience. Then again, the thought of Sirius as a teacher was enough to bring a wry smile to his face. Briefly, "I'll think about it. I am busy with another task at the moment." "Oh. Okay." Anyone else would have been unable to let the matter rest, needing to know more about the vague statement, but true to strange form, Luna let the matter drop. "How fast can you run when you've transformed?" Gara heaved a great sigh. Maybe he should just give up and resign himself to these conversations. Eventually, even the book-end girl would run out of questions and thought regarding him other form. Right? After the last class of the day let out, History of Magic, which had gotten everyone ready for a relaxed, nap-filled evening, Gara followed after a person he wouldn't have ever thought to follow before. Weasley was the peculiar mix of hostile and dull that made him a very unappealing stalking candidate. Not that Gara was following that particular person by choice. His thinking was that eventually Wormtail would try to re-establish contact with the youngest Weasley boy, before the summer holidays came and the rat was stranded in the surrounded castle with no escape or protection. This had led to the distasteful task of following the rat's owner whenever possible, if not to catch the rat in the return then to ascertain exactly when Ron had reacquired his pet. Following him on the rare occasions that he was one his own was child's play, but when the other two were with him it was actually something of a challenge in the long straight hallways of the castle. Ron was comically oblivious, but Hermione and Potter were both far more aware of their surroundings. Still, he wasn't a shinobi for nothing, so he made do. Sadly, all of this meant nothing when Ron was still loudly complaining that his rat was missing, and that Hermione's pet cat had probably eaten it. The possibility would have made Gara sick had Sirius not assured him that the half-Kneazle was on their side. During the evenings, Gara patrolled the castle for the rat, which was helped by the fact that the house elves kept the castle pretty clean where Filch couldn't get to, so any rats he was likely to find would either be another pet or the traitor himself. Sadly, he found no such traitors. Spending hour upon hour hunting for rats in a giant medieval castle was nobody's idea of fun, except perhaps one of the cats prowling around the place.
Well, that's the ending of that chapter. I do hope you enjoy this video. If you like to see more, remember to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel and leave a comment down below. Until next time.